Hello, everybody. Welcome to Talk About Houses. I'm Todd.
I'm Juana.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about home affordability because we keep hearing in the comments about how it's never been more unaffordable to buy a house. But that actually is not the case. And actually, it's not even close. Amazingly, 2023 is not the most unaffordable it's ever been to buy a home. Not even close. This is from an article that has a bunch of data in it. I'll read the first thing. I'll put up the chart and then let's have a conversation about this. Okay. In May of this year, the typical buyer spent just under a third of their household income, 32.8% on housing. Okay, that's total housing. As uncomfortable as that might not be, it's not even close to how much buyers plunked down in the early 1980s. Okay, I'm going to put this chart up and then we're going to go over the chart a little bit. Okay, this is the share of household income going toward housing. Now, if you look at the top line, that's the share, percentage share, and you can see the percentage numbers. And then also that bottom is mortgage rate. So if you look at this, you can see that the percentage share of household income, while higher than the last decade, is basically in line or less with most of the last few decades. And then same with interest rates. You can see mortgage rates are like 6%, but they were at one point almost 18%. Okay, and at one point, if you look back to the early 80s, over 50% of your income was going to pay for a house. Now, let's talk about some of the details about this. Homes were less, but people made less too.
That's right. So the median income in 1981 was $19,000.
Okay. And a home was less, but still, you're still paying over half of your annual income on housing expenses.
Right. And remember, I mean, it was so much different than it is today. So let me give you an example. Back in the 80s, 99.5% of your mortgage payment went to interest. I mean, let that sink in for a moment. 99.5% of your mortgage payment went to interest. So it took you a very long time to build up any equity at all.
On the front end.
On the front end, certainly.
Okay, how long did it take you to get 10% of your loan paid off?
I can't remember how many years.
17 or 18,
Yes,
right?
like 17 or 18 years. Yeah, so it was
over
crazy.
half of it, just to get to 10%.
Right. So today, 85% of that first year's mortgage payment goes to interest, which means 15% is going to principal. So think about that for a moment.
So it goes back in your pocket.
Right.
So 30 times, so a 0.5% versus 15% is 30 times more.
Right.
You're putting 30 times more in your pocket than the boomer did in 1981 who bought a house.
Right. And remember, that boomer was paying more than 50% of their income against the mortgage, and you're paying maybe close to 30%.
They're just complaining a lot more. Because, this is why I want it, people have short memories. And people just remember the last few years. They remember their friend who went and bought a house a few years ago and got a great deal and got a super low interest rate. And then they try to match that, and all they can do is compare with what they've seen the last few years. And like a couple frogs in a pot of boiling water, it takes a while for you to realize it's changed. So people don't realize how bad it was. Like these 6% rates we know from having done this a long time are not out of line. First rate I ever had on a house was about 10. Second time I bought a house, it was 8. And then it was 6. And then it was 4.5. The 4 primary houses that I purchased, those were the rates I got. You probably have a similar story.
Very similar story, yeah.
And I also remember, too, paying probably over a third of my income just on my house payment.
Right.
On the first house I ever had, I was just a brand new second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. Went out and bought a house with a VA loan, and the first, I think my first paycheck was like $700, and then $550 of that went to my mortgage.
Right. So, look, I mean, we understand that homes are unaffordable today by today's standards, but when you look at them historically, they're actually more affordable than they've been in a lot of times in history. Not only that, but so much more of your payment goes toward your principal payment, which means you're building equity.
Okay.
So if you bought a house, between 81 and 85, 86, then it took you like 17 or 18 years to build 10% of equity, while, today it doesn't take anywhere near that long.
And you couldn't just go on the internet and click a button and refi your house.
No, you
right?
could not do that.
Okay, here's some quotes from the article, some of the data. The typical household was bringing in only about $19,000 in 1981. According to the Census Bureau, mortgage rates topped 18% that year, that fall, and you thought 7% was rough. This is something else we talked about. The turbo-sized rates meant that 99.5% of a buyer's first year of mortgage payment was going toward the towering amount of interest on the loan. The buyer didn't pay down 10% of the principal till the 18th year, assuming they didn't refinance, which most people did. That calculation includes that they had to put 20% down.
Right.
There was a time you absolutely could not buy a house with that 20% down. You unless you were a VA. The VA, I think, was the only one that had a program. Or you did
FHA.
Were there FHA loans in the 80s? Okay,
Yeah.
FHA maybe. If you qualified.
Yeah.
FHA has more stringent income limits. So yeah, you may say, I'm sure your 18% FHA, the average person didn't make enough to buy a house.
Right.
Probably.
Yeah, so I mean, it was rough then. We understand it's rough now. You know those stories where your parents tell you that they walked both ways to school uphill in the snow? In this case, they're telling the truth.
Yeah, so this puts some things in perspective. The other thing, too, is remember that most people didn't, like a lot of people didn't own homes free and clear. People would buy a house, get financing, and then basically sell it, and then whatever equity they had go to another house. It actually encouraged home buying and selling with high interest rates declining over the years, because you're like, oh, well, our rate's 18%, but we can buy this house at 12%. That's a smoking deal. Let's just get rid of this 18%. We'll sell it now. That extinguishes the loan, go buy the 14. And then 5 years later, they're at 12%. And you're like, let's move again, because now we get a 10% or 12%. And they just kind of, people kept doing that really up till the housing crash. And remember, too, that housing interest rates didn't spike in 2006. They, if you look at 1990 to 2006, interest rates were still kind of trending down. And then 2008, they were down substantially from 2006. So it wasn't an interest rate problem. People are like, oh, interest rates, housing crash, recession, none of that mattered.
Right. So there were times that were harder to be a brand new homeowner than they are today. And we hope that maybe this gives you some perspective as to what is going on in the housing market today versus what the housing market has looked like historically. Now, I've said before that people are very adaptable, and that quality kind of cuts both ways. We are adaptable, which means that we tend to not look back and just move forward, which is great. But sometimes that is a hindrance because we forget that people had it harder than we have it today. You
know what's going to happen in a couple of years? People are going to see rates go under 5, be in the high 4s. They'll be like, wow, I have 4.75%. You remember a couple of years ago, rates were 7%? That was like the highest ever in the history of mankind.
Yeah.
They've never been 7%, and now they're 4 something. Wow, this is a really good deal. And then home prices will probably be double by then.
Right.
Okay.
So leave us some comments. Tell us the difference between now and then for you. What do you remember? We certainly remember the 80s very well. And for those of you that were around in the 80s, what do you remember? So share those memories with us. We appreciate it. Please remember to like the video, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share the video, and we'll see you on the next video. Bye.
Bye.